Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to tonight's event. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library here in London. We are delighted to be welcoming you to tonight's event, which promises to be a fascinating discussion with Professors Laura Levitt and Dawn Skorczewski on their two new books, led in conversation by Professor James Young. The panel will consider life after trauma, violence, and loss, and what makes this afterlife possible. The two authors will explore the role of art, literature, and writing in doing justice to the past, not necessarily in the juridical sense, and imagining different futures. We'll hear from Dawn Skorczewski, whose new book, Sig Becomes, Life and Art in the Aftermath of Bergen-Belsen, co-authored with Karen Mondag-Ralph, combines Holocaust survivor and artist Sig Becomes' testimony and writings with his art, giving voice to his experiences and creating a dialogue between trauma and art. In his haunting paintings and ceramics, Mondag expresses the suffering and joys of life in what Lawrence Langer terms the, quote, after death of Bergen-Belsen. As her work shows, when art becomes a way to depict, manage, and transform trauma, the work itself informs life. I've had the great pleasure of working with Dawn and Karen recently on Sig's work, and although unfortunately a planned exhibition could not come to fruition due to the pandemic, I still feel very fortunate to have met them both and to have been brought into this growing circle of thinkers who are considering Sig's work again and what it tells us about connections between art and trauma. Laura Levitt will discuss her challenging book, The Objects That Remain, which is both a personal memoir and an examination of the ways in which the material remains of violent crimes inform our experience of and thinking about trauma and loss. Considering artifacts in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and evidence in police storage facilities across the United States, Laura's story moves between intimate trauma, the story of an unresolved rape, and genocide. Throughout, she asks what it might mean to do justice to these violent pasts outside the juridical system or through historical empiricism, which are the dominant ways in which we think about evidence from violent crimes and other highly traumatic events. Over the course of her investigation, she reveals how these objects that remain and the stories that surround them enable forms of intimacy. In this way, she models for us a different kind of reckoning, where justice is an animating process of telling and holding. The two books, in my view, work very well together as meditations on, in Laura's words, quote, acts of commemoration as ongoing practices. Through Dawn's art and engagement with Sig's life's work, and through Laura's exploration of why we are drawn to particular texts, objects, and practices, we will discuss how we make meaning out of these representations and remnants from the past. So before I introduce our speakers, just a few notes of housekeeping. We are going to keep everyone on mute throughout the entire program. And if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to use the chat. And at the end of the formal discussion, we'll try to get to as many of these as possible. We have enabled auto transcription for those who need it. Just note that it is automated. So sometimes the text doesn't quite match the spoken word. And if you have any questions or technical issues, please send me a direct message and I'll try to do my best to help. Now to our speakers. Dawn Skorczewski is lecturer at Amsterdam University College and research professor of English Emerita at Brandeis University. Her research interests include the Holocaust, psychoanalysis, pedagogy, poetry, writing, and trauma. Several recent articles address the Holocaust survivors of the Dutch diamond industry, the interviewer's role in Holocaust testimonies, and Jan Karski's interviews. Laura Levitt is professor of religion, Jewish studies, and gender at Temple University, where she has chaired the religion department and directed both the Jewish studies and the gender, sexuality, and women's studies programs. Levitt is the author of a number of books, including, among others, The Objects That Remain, which was published in 2020, and American Jewish Loss After the Holocaust, published in 2007. They will be led in conversation by James Young, Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of English and Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he has taught since 1988, and founding director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. Professor Young has written widely on public art, memorials, and national memory. So with that, I would like to hand over to Dawn so she can take us through her book.
Thanks so much, Christine. It's such an honor to be here, and for so many different reasons. I'd like to thank you for inviting us here today, and also for your beautiful article on Sig Becomes that's coming out in an issue of American Imago, which Laura has also contributed to with Ruth Ost. which addresses the book actually. So that's an exciting thing. I'd like to acknowledge Dan Stone in the audience, who is also a real proponent of the book before it even became a book, but especially Laura Levitt, without whom I don't think this book would exist. And then there's Karen Mondog, who I think is in the audience. What a wonderful experience it was to work with Karen Mondog on this book. I think we met every week for a year, and it was, I miss it. I guess I would just say I miss it. I'm going to introduce you a little bit to the book, and then we'll talk more about some of the issues raised. As some of you already know, Sig Mondog was a little boy who grew up in the Netherlands. His father was in the Dutch diamond industry. The Dutch diamond Jews were allowed to stay in Amsterdam much longer than a lot of the Jewish people in Amsterdam when the war began and into 1942-43, because the Germans wanted the diamonds, and because also many of them were able to help with the construction or the imagination of the diamond industry. And they also knew the resources that were available from this population. So they kept charging them for the Speer, the ticket that would allow them to stay, right? So Sig stayed with his family into 1943 until they were sent to Westerbork, Camp Westerbork, and then on to Bergen-Belsen. By the time the war ended, here's Sig. You see him on the screen. He's being photographed the day after liberation, and he is wearing some new clothes that he found in a pile that he was allowed to go through in order to clothe himself at the end of the war. Those bodies that you see, he's looking away from them. He saw them every day. They were piling up around the barracks where he and 50 other Dutch children were incarcerated after their parents were taken away from them in Bergen-Belsen in 1944 in December. A Polish woman, Luba, helped these 50 children survive, and she had some help from some other women, but she really worked hard to help find food for them, and only 2 of the 54 actually died in the camp. So it was a miracle that these children survived. Some of them were reunited with their moms. Most of them never saw their fathers again because their fathers had been sent to Sachsenhausen. And Sig did see his mom again, and he was reunited with her, but he did not ever see his father again. So this picture, I just want you to keep this in mind, because the book begins with this picture, it ends with this picture, and in some ways, Sig's entire life was a meditation on this picture. Who is this little boy? What did he experience? And how can he go forward from this moment? I'm just going to show you now some of the paintings Sig made. I told you a little bit, or you heard a little bit about Langer's concept of the after death of the Holocaust, the paradox that survivors convey, which is that life stopped at Auschwitz or other camps like Bergen-Belsen or the ghettos, and then it went on afterwards, but that there are 2 selves, one self who died in the war, in the camp, and the other self who emerged and kept going. And the other concept that's key in the book is the idea of the identification with the aggressor, that in order to survive, the person who's in the camp has to in some way identify with the enemy, the persecutor, basically. And these self states of victim and aggressor are in the same person. So when you look at that painting on the right, you see someone looking off in the same direction as that child, right? But in a lot of paintings that you'll see here, there are 2 different pictures. There are 2 images of the face looking in 2 different directions. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble. There we go. So I told you a little bit about how he was born in Amsterdam, sent to Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, separated, and then saved by Luba. In his Shoah Foundation testimony, which is what we use in the book, we have him tell his story. He says his first recollection was fear, that when he was very young, he played with blocks at the door, and there was a woman walking on the other side of the street with one foot wrapped in bandages. She was merely a passerby, but it created fear in him. It was a scary sight, a woman with a stick bent over with tangled hair. He called for his mother. This painting, which we put together, which is called Child's Game, we put this painting, Karen and I, together with the words. None of the words and paintings were intended to go together. So one of the most creative things that we did together was to decide which painting, which object goes with which words that Sig was saying in his story. The other thing, which I had very little to do with because I don't speak Dutch, was the mix of the translation and how were these words going to be translated, because his testimony is in Dutch. The book that you will receive if you order it, Sig Becomes, Life and Art in the Aftermath of Bergen-Belsen, is in Dutch and English simultaneously. So you can see the act of translation as part of it if you speak both languages. That was a real challenge. And well, we had two translators, but I think at least one is here today, maybe both. And we were very lucky to have them with us, Marcella and also Geraldine. So coming into the theater where they were being held before they were sent to Bergen-Belsen, Sig's father was still a very proud man, and he didn't listen to an order by the guard, and he got hit. And that was the first time that Sig sees his dad, whom he really revered, being attacked, hit by a soldier, and he was embarrassed at first. And at the end of this part of the testimony, he says, I mean, it happened in the dark. It all happened in the dark, as he remembered it. And then they're off to Westerbork, where his dad has to carry big cans of milk on his back, and he really struggled. And Sig said, it's not bad to lift a crate or a milk can. I do stuff like that every day, he said, but his father couldn't, and I saw him suffering. He went under it. I didn't feel that with my mother. She was apparently stronger. Then they're sent by train to Bergen-Belsen, and he says to his dad, don't cry, Dad. And his father said, these aren't children anymore. And he points out that they did play in Westerbork, especially. They played games, Jewish lessons, Hebrew lessons. They played outside the barracks. We put it together with this painting called Chess Game. This is a painting that Laura spends a lot of time thinking about with Ruth in the article that she wrote. Very interesting painting. You can see that the paintings are all really different. Notice the figures here and how there are multiple gazes, multiple heads. In Bergen-Belsen, we saw the most horrible things. People who came too slowly from the trains were beaten. Women who were pregnant were threatened by dogs. That was horrifying. The worst scenes. On the platform, there were barking, biting dogs and people crawling together in agony. That's the picture, screaming Germans. You can imagine it, I think. Earlier, it was mentioned, I think, by Christine that Dan Stone and I wrote this article about Jan Karski's interviews. And when Jan Karski saw a scene like this, he almost couldn't bear it. He was an adult man, Polish man. He was observing for a moment what was happening at a train platform in a transit camp. And Karski almost went crazy, but is what he says when he saw this. So imagine this is what Sig saw, right? So Sig saw this and basically kept going, right? That's what he had to do. At that time, he was with his parents. This painting, the sheep on the right side, this is one of my favorites. We got up early, that was accompanied by noise, and then we had to appear on Appel. It was a torment because between those hundreds, sometimes they missed people or people were sick, and that could take hours. It was very bad. Children who were sick, or if the count wasn't right. It was also a game for the Germans. Let it be said that they were bullying us. Bullying was a thing, later I knew that it was bullying. I like this moment where he says, let it be said, because something you'll notice in the next few slides is Sig, he was a Buddhist. He definitely learned a lot from Buddhism. He and Karen went to the ashram relatively regularly, and also he went to India quite a few times. And one of the things he does is sort of show you, you'll see it in a moment, take a moment, look at the moment. And he says it here, let's look at this, let it be said. So remember I talked about the aggressor and the victim in one internal world. Look at that face looking off to the left, right? Or you could say to the right, depending on your perspective. He's looking off in the same direction as that little boy. And then there's this other face. These are the two selves of Sig Becomes, and he's trying in his life and in his art to get them together, to keep going with the two. My father was taken away. So this painting is called Holy Family. There's a lot of red in this painting, which I think of as kind of blood, and there's fear. And there's also a head that gets damaged on the right-hand side, right? A wound to the head. I think of that as trauma. My father was taken away from us as a diamond merchant. He was transported in that diamond transport. There was a list, he was on it, and they all went. He has a picture, he remembers them going away in tuxedos. This painting, which is one of his early paintings, I think you see a little dolly here perhaps. I feel that it matches well with this idea that they were taken away and they were all dressed up. These men were diamond merchants. They wore suits when they went to Bergen-Belsen. They might not have been wearing tuxedos as he remembered, but they dressed well for the next stage of their journey, but the next stage of their journey was largely murder. They were murdered. So there he is, we were abandoned. And then he says, Sister Luba was a woman who was discharged from Auschwitz, and she came into contact with us and decided to take care of us, and she took care of us. He wanted to get lost in her skirts like the other children, but he didn't because he felt he was too old. I was too big. I wanted to lean against her. I didn't. She was a surrogate mother. So when the war ends and you saw that picture was taken, he's sent back, finally brought back to Amsterdam. He's not reunited with his mom for many months because he was ill, like a lot of the kids. They had typhus, their lungs were really weak, they had been starved. So it took a long time for them to get back together, and he was with a lot of other kids. They threw him a big party when his mother finally found him. The way she found him is that picture that you saw. That picture was in Life magazine in May 1945. It was you've probably seen that picture. It also has Elie Wiesel in his bunk in that same issue. So his mom was sent that picture. She got it at the Diamond Exchange in Amsterdam after the war. Sig's uncle had found it in New York and sent 3 copies of it back to Amsterdam, I guess thinking maybe it would be of help. I don't know why he sent it exactly, but that's what she found. And she said to the Red Cross, my son is not dead, as you've told me. My son and my daughter, they're alive. I need to find them. And she did. So here Sig becomes a painter eventually. He traveled around for a while, a little bit lost. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? He started painting and things came together. Look at that on the right. Again, you see 2 faces. Look at that enraged, terrified face on the left. And look at the man looking back on the right. And there's his wife, Karen, with their little dog, Tulku. That's a picture of the couple, but he has 2 heads. He says, there's nothing to paint but faces. I see them as a reflection of my own face. Perhaps it is a constant search for myself. And we have Langer. I talked to you about the after death. So remember how I told you about this nugget, this idea of holding things up. I once walked through the camp bouncing a ball, and I came around a corner, and opposite me, there was a barrel with last scraps of food and men crawling around it, fighting each other to get the scraps from the barrel. But 1 meter, 1.5 meters away stood one man with a smile on his lips and a pan in front of him, waiting to get a hold of the very last scraps in the barrel. He was waiting for his turn. He didn't participate in the fight. That dear gentleman, that's a nice picture. At least I found a beautiful picture already back then. That was astonishing. I stopped. I held that ball for a moment and I looked at it. Ah, breathtaking. Maybe I would need it sometime later in the next life. I didn't cry at the time, but now I could cry for that man. And the image, I don't know what, it was a gift. For me, this is kind of the core of my work with Sig Becomes, how this little boy was walking through a camp. He's 7 years old and he's collecting images. This is called The Sign from the Greatest. This is a picture of him dancing with Karen, his wife. I just love this. And we put it on the cover of the book. I often thought of my mother in my dreams at night. I missed her the most. And I woke up crying. I was in pain, not really crying, but in pain with desire. It's called The Lovers. This is another really interesting thing that happened. Karen and I were looking at one of the paintings you already saw. We turned it around and this is on the back. Of course, Karen already knew it was there, but I hadn't seen it. And I feel like this is the image. It's an unfinished painting about the identification with the aggressor. On the left, you see the aggressor, the Nazi, the perpetrator. And what is he doing? He's feeding through his head poison, a kind of poison into the little boy's open mouth. And what happens to the boy as a result? He grows a distorted head. He grows something weird on the top of his head. It looks like a lamp almost. He becomes like somehow less than human or more than human or something different, monstrous. And this is what the boy struggles with for the rest of his life. This is called The Warrior. Sig went through a very dark period. Karen said that he said, even in the darkest moment, there's always hope. And this little light in the middle of The Warrior is the image of that. He did a ton of ceramics at the end of his life, or the last years of his life before he got a kind of dementia and suffered with that for a number of years, more than a decade before he finally died. It was a long struggle for the whole family. He made all of these beautiful ceramics. And he says, perhaps I have a search for the faces in the crowd, a search for my original face, my face as a boy. So he's always going back to try to find that boy and represent him. So that boy is in him. And also he's trying to transform that boy's life into something more. Here's Sig sitting with the photographer, George Rogers, who took the picture of him in Bergen-Belsen. There was a movie, a film made about him by Franz Bromek that was finished a few years ago, a beautiful film about Sig, and there's a lot about this story in it. This I just find, when I teach, I use this. This is a painting, and I'm just about to finish, by the way, of Karen, Sig's wife. This quote is from W.J.T. Mitchell. When students scoff at the idea of a magical relation of a picture and what it represents, ask them to take a photograph of their mother and cut out the eyes. I just love that he did that here, and the effect of it, I think, is quite profound. And here he is on the right. He's working on that chest painting, which is what Laura and Ruth study in their article. Look at this beautiful photo. And on the left, you see him a little closer to the end of his life. So I've kind of trotted through a lot of information and a lot of Sig's art, but I hope it gives you a taste of what the project is like. And I just want to turn it over to Laura to go next. Thank you. You have to unmute, Laura.
I have now unmuted. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's kind of a daunting task to go after Don and to certainly go after Sig. It's such an incredible story. So I am also going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and show you some images and give you a little bit of a sense of what the book does. But I also want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank Christine, I want to thank Dawn, and I want to thank James. It is really just an honor to be here with all of you. And I feel somewhat humbled to be, talking about my book and in part some of my own story in relation to this extraordinary tale of this remarkable artist. Okay. So my book is really a meditation on trauma, violence, and loss, and how objects help us hold and tell stories. And as you've already heard, it's in part my story. And I just have to say, this is something that really came out of Dawn's conversation with us about Sig and about that tension about the aggressor. And for those of you who've read the book actually begins with a prelude, and it's a prelude that talks about a childhood memory. And it occurs to me hearing Dawn say this, that I should really say something about that preface as a way of inaugurating our conversation across these differences. In that story, I tell both a story about my affection for objects and clothing in particular, but I also talk about a memory in blood. Which echoes some of the kinds of things that Dawn was talking about. And it's also a story about children. And it's a memory, a very vivid memory I have of visiting my grandmother, who lived up a series of very intricate steps that went up to a house on Long Island. And we were leaving the house. I have a brother who's about a year and a half younger than I am. And he fell and ended up in the hospital having stitches to his chin. And my memory of that is, I don't know if I pushed him or if I wanted to push him, but I was just obsessed by this. And I remember being in the car, and I was about 5 years old, and I kept saying to myself, blood, 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 blood. And I think that beginning the book this way, and I wasn't as conscious of it until really the book was published and I could actually see it. But there is, there's something about having been victimized or violated on the one hand, but also recognizing that kind of aggressor within. And so my book begins there. And I think it's also about a certain humility in relation to these categories of who is where. And I think, kind of echoes some of the kind of implicated selves that Michael Rothberg has asked us all to think about, our various implications. So my book is really as you've already heard, it's part my story, but it's also about other stories of violence and violation writ large in relation to the Shoah on the one hand, and writ small, but not so small, in relation to violent crimes. So my having been raped and the story of Maggie Nelson, the beautiful writer's memoir and her book of poems about her aunt, Jane Mixer, who was murdered. And so I use these stories to kind of think about the ways in which all of these different kinds of experiences of trauma and loss can be in conversation with each other. And I use objects as my way in. But on the other hand, I'm also very interested in the craft. And so in that sense, art and literature are very much a part of what the book is about. And what I'm really trying to do in the book is to think about how, as you heard from Christine, how justice is not juridical, but really about a kind of acknowledgement, a kind of recognition, a seeing and a hearing, and that it's through those acts that justice can be done. And it's not necessarily juridical. And I'm push against the juridical because I'm really interested in these ongoing practices. And part of what I also hope is that the book also provides a kind of companionship for those who have been violated, to find ways of, the surprise of finding connections to each other, what Svetlana Baum talks about as diasporic intimacy, when you've lost everything and you can be surprised by moments of tenderness. So I thought I would just then tell you a little bit about the sort of content of the book. And I will just say the book is in more or less two parts, framed by that prelude that I just told you about in an introduction. So the first part is called Sacred Text, and really these are works of various kinds of literatures that I understand as sacred, in the ways in which they are able to animate stories of trauma and loss and violation through language. And I became very obsessed with Maggie Nelson's work and with Edmund Duval's work, and they are the writers and artists whose labors really inspired my own, and they were, those texts provided companionship for me, and my hope was that my book might be able to pass that on to others. And there's also a little bit of a medieval interlude, which is about the allure of bloody garments in a series of Ashkenazi medieval texts about trauma and loss. The second part of the book is really about the arts and rites of holding. And here I talk about the practices of holding and what they enable. So I talk on the one hand about the work of police property management, what they do with the stuff in police property rooms and property lockers across the United States, because I look at the American example on the one hand, and ask questions about why we hold on to these objects and what work they do if they don't go to court, but also asking questions about why some things like rape kits are not processed and don't make their way to court. And then on the other hand, I look at the work of conservators and collection managers and curators at places like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and ask about the objects in their care. And then the last chapter, which is Tending to Sacred Objects, builds on Robert Jan van Pelt's work with the Waterloo team for the 2016 Biennale, the Architectural Biennale, which was that year devoted to questions about the ethics of architecture. And what they created was something called the Evidence Room, which is what I'm calling a kind of contemporary Holocaust reliquary, a kind of space that holds Holocaust memory. And those of you who don't know, the room is made up of Robert Jan van Pelt's critical testimony, the documents of that testimony. They cast them in plaster and made them tactile, and they became the walls of this room. And then they reconstructed some of the elements of that architecture of destruction, and they become what they call the evidence room. And then finally, I have a coda. So what I thought I would do, just to complete my presentation is just to show you some of the images that I write about. So in the introduction, I write about being in the offsite facility, the storage facility at the United States Holocaust Museum, and seeing a conservator working on a quite elaborate prisoner uniform. This is not that uniform, but it gives you a sense of the tactile and the ways in which the haptic is such an important part of the objects that I write about, particularly clothing. So I begin with this object. In the police property management chapter, I write about the artwork of an amazing contemporary artist in New York. Her name is Eliza Schwartz. And this is a piece from a work that she did called Anthem 2019. It's an ongoing project about rape kits and what they are and what they do and how they imagine bodies. And she's been collecting them from all of the 50 states, as many as she can get. And what you also see is that there is no uniform thing called a rape kit. But her work was really inspiring, and I wanted to include it as well. So this is a close-up of one of those kits. This photograph, which is a quite extraordinary photograph, comes from a piece called Evidence, 1977, and it was created by the late Larry Sultan, an extraordinary photographer, and Mike Mandel, his partner in this project. And what they did is they collected these images from a whole series of industrial and governmental police and firefighter archives. And they constructed this work from these images that they had culled from these different places and called it Evidence. And the idea was they have no labels, they have no names, and they put them together and ask us to engage with them. And I write some about this work. And I also want to say that I also write about its afterlife and the ways in which it comes back to life with a very different kind of slant in 2005, when it was displayed in Berlin in a gallery in a former Jewish girls' school. And I just think that the haunting presence of this kind of evidence and what we think of when we think of evidence really moved me. But I wanted to, and I write at some length about that work. Finally, this is almost finally, this is Kristen Caron's green sweater. Some of you may know that it has become very well known. There are now actually kits at the museum store where people are reknitting the sweater. But this is the sweater that her grandmother made for her. And she wore it when she was in hiding in the sewer system in Lviv. And she donated it to the museum. And I write about, this extraordinary child's sweater, which is a piece of rescued Holocaust evidence held in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's collection. And lastly, I wanted to just give you a little bit of taste. It's hard to really kind of fully appreciate the evidence room, but this gives you some idea of what that room looks like. But what you can't tell is that as the light hits it, these walls, these are all of the pieces of evidence, as I said, that became three-dimensional, and they're all in white. And when the light hits them, you can see the images and the words, the photographs that have then been reconstructed. And then each of these other elements, this is the flue, this is one of the hatches, and this is the infamous door that was reconstructed so that it wouldn't close in but out, and they put that horrible peephole in it. And these were all elements that were then reconstructed very carefully by the Waterloo team and their students to do this piece. So I think I will stop here. There's so many more things to say, and I'm stopping myself because I hope that we can talk more the kind of conversation. So thank you so much.
So both these books are amazing. And it's still strange to be so informed by such shattering books as well. Each book in its own way is shattering. Laura, of course, meditating on an unsolved crime, which she was a victim. And when we think now so often of as memory in the service of justice, you know, I kind of want to ask, you know, begin by asking Laura, what does it mean then to remember, not to remember and never actually remember toward justice? That you wanted the certainty of evidence, I think, was kind of one of the aims that you found in these objects. And is memory somehow, could you still find closure and a way to work through, even though there was never justice, you know, to be found alongside, you know, the evidence and the power of the objects that you recovered? Just to begin.
Well, I guess I have to say that I sort of gave up on a kind of juridical justice. I had to, and I part of what I appreciate about Maggie Nelson's memoir, The Red Parts, and reading it over and against Jane the Murder, her book of extraordinary narrative poems, is that even in that exceptional case that actually, you know, belatedly went to court, what I really discovered was that Maggie Nelson's writing did more justice to her aunt's life and death than what happened in the courtroom. And that was a gift to me. And it was the kind of not only companionship, but really a gift that said, no, justice is something else. And she, you know, writes, and I cite her talking about justice doesn't come from on high. It's not that, but it's what we do with each other. So in sharing our stories, I think there is a kind of doing justice. And so for me, that's been really powerful. And I guess I'm not sure there's closure. That's not a word that works for me, but I think that, you know, that we live with these legacies and we live in these afterlives. And part of what I wanted to kind of, you know, I talked about my being the, you know, my identification with the aggressor. But I think on the other hand, there's also this sense that sometimes you think that you died and you did, you know, and that this is all a dream. And I really, that interplay that I think also is so much a part of Sig's work, right? Is that, you know, the sort of the euphoria of, I mean, I spent years I met you, James, early in my career, which happened in the aftermath of all of this. And I can't express how, you know, how extraordinary it felt to be alive and to get to have this life that you so want. And I feel like, you know, that comes out in a certain kind of productivity and a kind of critical engagement. And this is what I so much see in Sig's work. And that's part of what I love, the passion and the ongoingness of it, and coming back and seeing it and turning it and seeing it in a different way. So I hope that answers the question,
Yeah.
sort of.
Oh, this idea of ongoingness is crucial. I also dislike the whole notion of closure, which I associate with being closed off, you know, closing off to ongoingness, and the working through and the ongoingness and the kind of the durationality of memory are all of its most important properties, you know, as far as I'm concerned. So, well, many Holocaust scholars get asked over and over, especially by kind of lay audiences, but really in my writing, I think even when I was writing my dissertation and interviewing survivors and historians, they would ask me, so how can you do it? How can you spend all that time in reading these miserable texts and memoirs and diaries? And I wasn't sure at first, but then I realized that the only way that this didn't overwhelm me was if I kept it at what I used to call writing arm's length. As long as I could write about it and work through it in writing, that I was actually approaching it and keeping a distance at the same time. It was my way of mediating and protecting myself from kind of the visceral power of both objects, which I made a lengthy critique of, and the power of these stories, the survivor stories, and even many of the victim stories. So Dawn includes a kind of a great quote in her introduction, which I wanted to ask her about in this context. You write that Sig often repeated Picasso's statement that painting is therapy. He used art to express, elevate, transform, and abate his suffering, unquote. So the question is how does his art help him work through memory and trauma, as opposed to being re-traumatized by such memory? They say that the neuroscientists now tell us that when we remember something, we actually fire up the same synapses that fired during the experience itself, so that this distance between memory and re-experiencing the trauma gets collapsed in this weird way. We end up reliving these terrible experiences, and thereby possibly run the prospect of re-traumatizing ourselves, or I should say the victims can end up re-traumatizing themselves. And in Laura's case too. So I would like Dawn to talk about how Sig did it, and then I think I would like to ask Laura how she did it, how she worked through by writing without kind of re-traumatizing. Because there was the sense that in every loss we re-experience all of our losses, and every trauma we kind of re-experience all of our traumas. And Laura writes about this beautifully in the story of going to Mexico City on vacation, and then her lost suitcases kind of bringing back the whole violent crime, against you, how you were just re-traumatized in a weird way about this loss. But Dawn, could you work through a little bit how Sig saw this process as therapy?
I absolutely can. I really appreciate the question. And I think it's important to say that we can't speak about these issues without sort of standing on your shoulders, James. Like, we can't think and talk about the Holocaust without acknowledging that you kind of got to this territory first, and that you're one of our most important influences, right? More than an influence like that. And Steph Craps is in the audience too. And he too has helped us to think about these things in really important ways. I do a lot of work with psychoanalysis. I always have. And one of the things I understand about trauma through contemporary psychoanalysis, especially, not Freudian, but people who deal mostly with dynamic systems and how people make change in their lives, is that when you're traumatized, one of the definitions of trauma is being in the past. You're actually not out of the past, you're in the past. So if you think about Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and the character Milkman, he's sitting in the car with his parents and he's actually turned around. He is sitting looking out the back window, right? So Morrison's job, or her narrator's job, is to try to get him to turn around, right? Can you look into the future, Milkman? And what would that look like with the whole slavery past behind you, like with every slave behind you and all of the trauma that your family has endured and every other family around you? So that's Toni Morrison, right? So with Sieg Mondog, here's that little boy looking away from the bodies. But the fact is, those children played in the bodies in Bergen-Belsen. They played hide and seek, and they all talk about that when you interview them, which is a really powerful experience. But when you see that image of him talking about the painting, The Sign from the Greatest, and talking about the nugget of a man standing waiting for his tiny piece of a scrap of food. So there's Sieg in the moment in Bergen-Belsen trying to find something to keep going with, right? So when he moves into his life and he falls madly in love with this gorgeous, gorgeous woman, Karen, who's also a very soulful Zen person and brilliant, what happens is, on the one hand, they start building a life together. They have 2 children. They're living in Amsterdam. His mom is there too. He's painting. On the other hand, he's haunted, right? He has rages. He's overwhelmed. He's having nightmares, right? So he's in Bergen-Belsen sometimes, even though he doesn't want to be. Right after the war, his mother moved to the near the ocean, near the water, so that he maybe could start to heal, because he was so traumatized. And the neighbors in the film about him talk about how he kept them up at night screaming. That his nightmares when he was 7, 8 years old were keeping the neighborhood awake. And she was angry. They were angry because the whole country wanted to leave it behind, right? They wanted to leave behind that 75% of the country's Jewish people had been sent off to be murdered, right? But people like Sieg, little children screaming in the night, reminded them, right? So here's trauma with us. And what do you do with it? So the only thing, from my point of view, that you can do with it that really might work to help you manage it is to make art, if you're Sig Becomes, right? And to make love, to make a family. So that's what he does. But it's not without it being with him all the time. So Anne Sexton once wrote, "I didn't forgive my father, I just wrote that I did." She wrote a poem that she forgave him. So as you can see, I have a lot to say about this subject. It's what I think about a lot. And I've talked with Laura a lot about it too. Thanks for the question.
Of course. Laura, what's your sense of having worked through or?
Well, I feel like, I don't know, like Sig, I don't know who I would have been had this not happened to me. I don't know what I would have written. I don't know, I don't know what my career would have looked like. That's just a road I can't touch, right? I can't go there at all. Mm-hmm. And yet I've written about my rape many different times in different ways. And of course it changes over time, right? My relationship to it. So I think that, I spent a long time working through this book, and I think that in some ways it kind of marks a shift from some of those earlier considerations. So in Jews and Feminism, The Ambivalent Search for Home, my first book, I wrote about home and rape and what are the places we call home and how contingent they are. And then I wrote about American Jewish loss after the Holocaust. And I was determined not to talk about my rape. And I wrote an essay that I published elsewhere, kind of to keep it over there. And I was really, really proud of myself for that. And I would say, even in writing this book, there was a part of me for a very long time that said, if you asked me what the book was about, I would talk about it's about material objects held in police storage and in Holocaust collections. And I did not talk about my own work, my own story. And so the process of writing allowed me to get to a different place. And again, it's not like it's, it may be different 10 years from now, but I also think that there's got to be a kind of, talking about the sort of euphoria of those of us who survive or such experiences. And I don't mean to make these the same. They're really radically different experiences. I want to be very careful about that. But the sort of gratitude and the sense of awe in being alive was really, really powerful. But other losses, of course, remind us of our frailty and our finitude. My mother died in the process of my writing this book, and I didn't fully appreciate that until, really losing her was kind of how the sort of ongoing euphoria kind of ended. And I ended up in a different afterlife as I talk about it. And realizing how much she held me up, and so I think there are these sheddings, right? And somehow just being able to say that these are a part of our lives, and they do kind of, the terrible also makes the lovely parts that much more lovely, and I think that's a piece of it for me, certainly.
So I'll pose kind of a similar question to Don, but back to these objects. Laura presented some of this at a kind of a Yom Yun in my honor a while back, just when I retired, and recalled some of the ways that I had talked about this, what I really regarded as kind of this unseemly veneration of ruins and relics by museum curators, especially Holocaust curators, and I was first moved by these visits to Majdanek, where I saw the ruins being used to tell a very particular story, which was actually unhistorical. So that they were using the relics to endow the narratives with the naturalness of the relics forms. And that was kind of my, one of my theses here. And so I've always been suspicious and kind of skeptical of this ongoing veneration, but Laura, because I always wondered toward what kind of knowledge and understanding are we being moved? No doubt there is an effective power in these relics. And I moved too, viscerally, haptically moved. But Laura answered the question basically quite definitively and comprehensively, making me appreciate just how valuable and interesting and meaningful this affective power is, and how it creates both meaning and memory, and meaning in memory. And I don't know if you could summarize, Laura, just a couple of the ways that you completely persuaded me. Your whole study, in fact, the whole book and meditation won me over. And so I would actually, it changed my mind. I'm not just suspicious. Now I understand how it works, and you basically taught me how it works. So could you reflect just a bit on why it's so important to understand the kind of the haptic visceral power of these objects, and to allow for it, and what kind of meaning it makes?
Right. Well, and James, I mean, I've learned so much from you, as Dawn said as well. But I think also when you began doing your work, there were lots of survivors who were vital and telling their stories, and you were engaged with them. And so there is a kind of interplay between, this is also kind of contextual, right, and historical. So in part, my book comes in this moment as, survivors are aging and are becoming frail, and many are dying. And I think that the kind of power of the objects that I'm talking about have a different resonance now than they might have taken then. And they may have been displacing people in the context in which you were working, which I think was probably important, and a reason, I would argue, for why you might have gone in that direction, because they weren't replacing them, right? I mean, replacement is such a terrible term to use in the present moment. But I think that that the power of objects now, in particular, is that they take up space, and they were there then, and they're here now, and they kind of remind us that it's, as I talk about it, that it's not a dream, right? When I wrote about the uniforms that are held in the museum's collection in Washington, they're so frail, and of course all of these things were never meant to last forever. They're really disintegrating, because and their power is that they are these historical objects that are wounded objects, that are tainted objects. And so I just love that, trying to preserve them, right, means, like, this is why the exhibit of the shoes in Washington is in a room that is darker. A lot of the darkness in the museum, people think it's just effect, but that's also keeping some of the objects alive, to the extent that they're alive. And but I think that when I think about the kind of care for those clothes, so the people who wore those uniforms are by and large not with us. And yet at the museum, because they wore them day in and day out, they carry some, traces of those people. Yeah. And the idea that you would create a kind of a mannequin-like hanger that would help keep the frail clothing alive is, it's about a recognition of the proximity of those objects to then and there, and to here and now. And and talking to the conservators, who, say, if you don't understand the meaning of these objects, you can't really handle them, right? And so I think taking in the sort of, I use the language of relics and sacred objects, and thinking about the sacred as a way of paying homage to these imminent forms of kind of reverential objects is really a way of keeping the past alive, really, so that different people can tell different stories and breathe new life into them, right? That's the promise at its best of an archive or a library like this one.
Yeah, so interesting. So Dawn, at the very heart, as you described it, of your book is that stunning photograph, the Life magazine photograph. And you make very clear that, in fact, that's an altered photograph, that what the little boy is avoiding in this, what little Sig seems to be avoiding, he's not actually avoiding because he's already seen it. And when his face goes away, it actually draws our eyes right to those corpses in this horrible way, because we want to know what he's avoiding, and that's what he's avoiding. But Life magazine avoided something much worse. I mean, kind of the indignity of these prisoners' conditions, when they died. And just as Life magazine used to alter the photographs of American soldiers fallen on the beaches and kind of blur out their faces to create kind of symbolic corpses, there was this way in which this became a symbolic corpse, not to be dirtied by too much death and the horrible conditions in which they died. Could you reflect on this distance between the altered photograph and the original photograph, which you show both? And there's this way in which little Sig walking by presents that kind of that trope of ongoingness. He's moving through it, and he kind of carries us with him throughout the rest of his life.
Thanks, James. It's really important to know that Werner Sollers, a Harvard professor, wrote a really wonderful essay, thorough essay about this photograph.
Sure.
That I think was published about 3 or 4 years ago. So I've read that essay, and it deals a lot with the relationship between what Time magazine did, or Life magazine rather, with that photo to edit it for its viewers and what is in the photo. But one thing he doesn't mention, which I think is perhaps because it's so bad, is that those women in the photo are covered with diarrhea. Like they're really covered, and their faces are really visible. You can see them as people, right? And there were a lot of Dutch women at that time in the piles, right? So maybe Sig knew those women, probably not, but they were visible as women, and their bodies were covered, excuse me, with excrement. So what Sig was probably looking away from, as I think about it, was something really actually specific. And what the audience is looking away from is something general, right? Like the general fact of genocide, right? So I feel like this sort of specificity of the image is something that was central to Sig's life and his art. And what I think of when I talk about this is how both of his children, Simon and Sarah, tell stories about Sig. He loved to take his kids to museums on Saturdays, and he would say it's Daddy Daughter Day or Daddy Sunday. And he would go, and Sarah tells a story. He took her to a dolly exhibition, and they were going around, and he would say to her, "What do you see? What do you see?" And then they would stand in front of a painting and talk about it. And she said when they went to this particular exhibition, they had a whole crowd following them after a while, because this man and his daughter were so compelling. Their conversation was so compelling that all of these people were following them around as if they were tour guides. And Simon tells a similar story, that he would say, his dad would say, "Let's go to the museum," or "Let's go to the gallery." And he's like, "No, I want to play soccer." And he's like, "No, I want to see what you see." And it was very important to him that his children say and look carefully and say what it is that they saw. So his insistence on looking carefully is a part of how he gets out, I think, that he looks carefully at it, he shows it to us, and then that helps him somehow to integrate and move on. Now, does he escape that way? No, no. Like, I think it's really important to say that meditation that he does in art and in life ties him as much as it frees him. And so, to go back to something that was said in the chat and something that you said, James, that issue of closure is really that's not the right way to think about it, right? Yeah.
Wow. I've got several more questions. Christine, do we have time for at least one more each? Or,
yeah, why don't you, yes, exactly. Why don't you take one more each? And then if participants have questions, we have one already, so we can reserve that for after your questions.
But we could turn to the audience questions as well.
Unless you want to grab that one now, because it actually just fits together with what Dawn was just talking about from Jamie about thinking of closure as an asymptotic process where we never arrive but describe our trajectory in relation to it.
Sure.
So I don't know if Dawn, you want to take that one, or Laura, and comment. And
I think I'll throw it to Laura, because I think I was sort of talking about it as I spoke. So if that's okay, Laura. No.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I guess I would add from what Dawn has said, it's a great question, is that, there is a way in which if you're always kind of striving for the limit, then it's defining. So there is a kind of there is a kind of linearity or a kind of teleological thing that drives. So I guess I would be a little bit careful. And this is probably why I think that's why I don't like closure. I think for that reason. Or healing is usually not going to something out there, but kind of going back. And, as we are leaving COVID-ness, I think we all are much more attuned to the ways in which, when it's over, it's not like we go back to normal, right? Nothing is the same. It will never be the same, right? And I think that that's a kind of sobering thing that, of course, the work that we do tells us in so many ways.
This idea of healing and repair is something I've thought a lot about, especially thinking about so-called anti-redemptive memorials, which don't really want healing, but they want actually to preserve the wound. We make very clear that we can't compensate it, we can't really domesticate it, we can't repair it. So at one point when Laura's talking about her potter friend, says, writing, like making new pots, she writes, out of old clay, helps contain brokenness and can even make it beautiful. And that reminds me, of course, of this Japanese tradition of mending broken pots, this kintsugi, the repair broken pottery with inlaid gold, which is a way to value the scars and brokenness, to mend it, but to show that, in fact, these are also part of life, and therefore part of the beauty of life is having lived and broken, lived and tripped, lived and failed, lived and suffered, that we need to wear that too, but the pottery can now wear that too, is in its own ongoingness. And I'm curious if that ever struck you, Laura. You've been in your talk.
I think I love that pottery. I was just so immersed in Duvall's work, and I get kind of obsessed. So I also, read the book about porcelain and his journey towards porcelain, and his grandmother's memoir, and I just got very excited about it. And but I think that the fragility of pottery and its tactility are all for the reasons you said. And then this, this idea of the brokenness. I have a boo-boo on my finger and I realize it's showing too. I think that, in that sense, I think that's really, my book demonstrates that too, right? There's the euphoria and all of that and all that's really beautiful. And I think Sig's work even more so, right, is just this unbelievable, it's there, right? The two faces are always there. They don't go away, but they do help us appreciate, the fragility of our existence. And
if I could jump in on that, when the book was published, it was almost to the day of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, right? So it's almost to the 75th anniversary, to the day of when this photograph is taken. And I was so obsessed with that fact when I was working on the book with Karen, and determined that the publisher had to get the book out on that day, and that somehow this would get Sig's work into Holocaust museums, and that everyone would be buying the book and reading it and so into Sig's story, and they would know about him, and they would honor his memory and his work. And I was really obsessed with this, right? And what ended up happening is that COVID was, right? So the book comes out when COVID is happening, and the 75th anniversary is not really much of anything in the way that it would have been in Amsterdam had we not had COVID, right? So I remember sitting in my apartment, and Karen had given me for my birthday, which was about a month and a half before, this gorgeous bowl that Sig had painted. And I was sitting there and I was looking at this book, and I was looking at this bowl, and I was thinking, this is what you have. This is what you have. You have this object and this book and this story. And then we just keep going with our lives with these things, and we try to remember. Students will tell you, or survivors, you go to a holiday celebration with survivors. Anna Ornstein, who might be here, I think, she's 94. And when you go to her house for Passover, which I hope to do again this year, if possible, she'll say, well, if only my brother could be here, that would be nice. If my dad could be here, that would be nice. And then, in Maus, sometimes I think Spiegelman makes it seem like that's a bad thing that you know, the dead brother is here, but he also, I think at the end, elevates it, right? And I think that's what Anna's doing. Like, let's remember these people who would have been here because they're in a way still here, right? So I feel, you know, yes, that what I dreamed for the book was sort of this, you know, I wanted Sig to be in the museum, right? I really wanted that badly. And now what I want is this. Like, I have this group of people. A lot of people are now talking with us about Sig Mondog, right? And looking at images. And one final thing, which is that, you know, I met Laura on a train randomly after a AJS meeting, I don't know, Laura, like a decade ago. And what I took from that meeting was that one of the most remarkable people I'd ever met, I happened to sit next to on a train. What serendipity, like what a gift for my life that happened. And now a book that I, you know, really ended up making it with Karen in part because of Laura, right? And so I feel so grateful that these things happen this way, I guess, you know. Yeah.
So funny you bring up, of course, the missing brother and that story. The very last page of Mouse, it's Saul Friedlander's only example of where deep memory can actually be pictured, and it demands both the image and the text. That in that interaction, you can do it by mistaking Artie for Rikiev. Rikiev, it's he says that's enough for now, Rikiev, and the story is over. So on page 123 of your amazing book on Sig, of course, you have him saying that I looked outside when he was at school and wanted to be there outside. I wanted to play and not be bothered by straitjackets and rules. That school was a kind of concentration camp for me. I had lifelong trauma from school, where he also substitutes school for concentration camp. And I think that's your example of that deep memory. You actually get to show it like that.
Oh, that's, thank you, it's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Christine, what do you think?
Well, I think we've gone over now, so I think we should probably close. Although I'm sure, as I probably can speak for many people in the audience, I think we could go on and continue this conversation for a lot longer. So I wanted to thank all of you, Dawn, Laura, and James, for having this conversation and for organizing this panel. And thank you to all the participants for your comments and your questions. And you can see there's some lovely praise coming in the chat. And I put links in the chat for purchasing the book. And you know, so if anybody's interested, they're there if you scroll up. And of course, you can also contact me after the event, and I can pass on any comments or questions to you. So once again, thank you, Laura and Dawn, especially for these books. And thank you for doing this event. It's been really delightful listening to you speak and to hearing about your process.
I echo. Thank you, Laura and Dawn, for these amazing books and for keeping us company as we walk through this whole thing.
Thank you both. All. Thank you all three.
Thank you, and good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.